This is a motoring adventure across half the world in an 83-year-old car. My name is William McIntosh. My father Noel and I drove alone from London to Vladivostok and then across Japan. Noel and my mother drove the car across Australia in 1988 on the Australian Bicentennial Rally from Darwin to Adelaide to Sydney, some 6,000 kilometres. In 1991 they took part in the USA Transcontinental Rally from Williamsburg to Vancouver, a 5,000 kilometre journey in the company of 29 cars all built before the First World War. For many years both of us have been inspired by the books about the classic long-distance races of the veteran era. Having completed the USA half of the 1908 Great Race, which was from New York to Paris, we hoped we could now complete the whole race route if we crossed Russia and Japan. Until a mere 7 years ago, Russia was a superpower on par with the USA. They had sent a man into space and shot down Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane, a first world country with great engineering feats. We expected to visit museums, meet old car owners, maybe find some veteran cars and be able to connect up our computer to the internet. Well, were we in for a surprise. We knew we faced many dangers in Russia. The nightmarish bureaucracy could very easily have bogged us down. Our adventure would not have been possible in the old Russia, and we were not sure how it had changed in the remote parts of the country. We feared police corruption or misconception about what we were doing, and so we were worried about being prohibited entry to many of the countries we traversed. Following the Russian presidential elections, which occurred during our first week in Russia, we were concerned that we might have to evacuate in the event of internal chaos. Using a 1913 car certainly increased the probability of our breakdown, but the old car was the main reason for our adventure, so we were never tempted to use a modern four-wheel drive. The terrible road conditions could easily destroy our 83-year-old car. Most Russians felt assault by criminals would be the greatest danger, and so did friends who had visited Russia. Every Russian we met warned us that the car would be stolen, or at best vital parts would be pinched. Our doctors gave us a long lecture on the risks and sicknesses prevalent in Russia, and we had many injections and pills for most of them. Noel even had some surgical deburring so that he could sit for long periods. The freestyle driving of the Russian and Polish drivers made the likelihood of a car accident a high probability, especially in a car with only rear-wheel brakes and skinny tyres. If we did have an accident or had some other loss, we could not claim on insurance, as we could not buy any for Russia or Poland. The normal worries about loss of travel documents was made worse by the remoteness of the areas we would travel through and the sheer number of documents. Our only link with the outside world was our high-tech equipment, which was just the sort of thing that would be coveted by thieves. The preparation and planning was a massive effort. The car was prepared meticulously, dismantled to the last nut and bolt. We rebuilt 2 engines with the same size bores and crankshaft so the parts could be interchanged. We also marked parts with white paint to enable us to assemble the car in the dark. We tested the car over 2,500 kilometres around Victoria State. Parts failed and our fears mounted over the vulnerability of the old car. Noel and Donna headed off to the 1996 Fever International Rally, hoping that there'd be no more breakdowns. It was a brilliant 10-day rally around the north of England, starting in Edinburgh. They did about 1,500 kilometres and tested the car on many occasions, travelling in the company of 300 vintage and veteran cars. These are some of the more famous places they visited. The weather was sunny and Noel had time to relax before we began our Russian adventure. In the meantime, I continued with preparation in Sydney, which had taken 18 months till now. We had a list of 500 activities and 6 inches of paperwork. We had written more than 150 letters and emails, sadly with very few replies. We ended up with only 3 people who could meet us or help us over the entire 14,000 kilometre journey.
This is York Minster.
This time the car was perfect, and they confidently drove down to London on the 22nd of June to meet me, having flown in from Sydney.
Donington Park. We've just done a lap of the circuit. Put on over.
We met friends beneath Big Ben and repacked the car to make space for me, as Donna was accompanying us to Berlin. We were carrying a lot of spares and camping equipment. We designed special touring equipment to carry all this stuff, while we retained the car's veteran character. So here we were, on the other side of the world, making the final preparations before leaving on this epic solo journey. It felt quite eerie and unreal to be so far from home, with only an old car to get us across the world. These friends brought us food and drink for a good farewell picnic on the lawns of Westminster Abbey. We drove off with the sun on our backs, wondering what the weather would be like for the rest of the journey. We decided not to go through the English Channel, as this meant travelling through France and Belgium, and neither of those countries would give us insurance. So Harwich was our destination on the first day, where we would catch the ferry over to Holland. Our Dutch partners had arranged a mayoral welcome in the beautiful city of Gouda.
And of course, I'm very honored that you choose this city for your first stop. And as I learned, your only official stop in the Netherlands. And you, William, have become very curious about Gouda.
We were shown around the historic City Hall, which is the most photographed hall in Europe.
Yes, Noel should have started it with the crank. Okay, Noel's now taking...
The mayor jokingly asked us if our car would satisfy the frequent police checks on old cars. It was difficult to say yes when we knew we'd fail any test.
Cheese Museum here, who's presenting a beautiful Gouda cheese.
Real Gouda cheese.
We left Gouda with the flag flying and joined the E30 motorway, which we hoped to use all the way across Germany and Poland to Moscow. It was a very busy road packed with speeding semi-trailers, which was very frightening. Thankfully, there were no police checks.
This is Hanover University.
We passed through the old border post and the massive collective farms, which are not fenced.
These are the big collective farms in East Germany. We're now in East Germany.
The Germans are rebuilding the East German motorways without disrupting the traffic. The old bridges are being replaced as the communist concrete is falling apart. The new flyovers are very impressive. Donna was sheltering under the covers in the back of the car and kept popping up for fresh air.
About 50 k's.
Berlin is a most beautiful city, with wide tree-lined streets and sidewalk cafes. We did a walking tour around vandalized East Berlin, where palaces, grand buildings and history were destroyed in the name of Soviet progress. We serviced the car and did some checks on a noisy valve, but couldn't find any problems. We're here enjoying ourselves. We said goodbye to Donna, who had wisely chosen to fly home, and we drove towards Poland. We were now on our own and feeling like two little people taking on the world. We soon came across hundreds of trucks parked on the side of the road. Eventually, after about 10 kilometres, we came to the Polish border. We made an easy border crossing, where we opened the bonnet and created a lot of interest before heading off to Warsaw, across western Poland.
We looked around, found the weekend rates were very good, and after having spent the night on a farmer's clump of trees, we thought we could justify having a night in Warsaw's top hotel.
During our 2 days in Warsaw, we enjoyed the magic flute and mixed with the local music society. The Russian border post was a disaster. The crowd waved us to the front of a 25-hour queue. I was filming when a Bolshevik guard came up and demanded the camera. After some fast talking, I was allowed to keep it, but we were told to get to the back of the queue. By this time, we had a crowd of backers and negotiators who advised us to drive 30 kilometres to a smaller border post where there were traffic consultants who would get us over the border for $100 US. So now we were in Russia, late in the afternoon, with 8 hours of motoring to Minsk. It was a hell trip because we have no windscreen wipers and very poor headlights. We set off early the next day to avoid the impending rain and hoped to buy petrol before we left Minsk bound for Smolensk. We failed to find any in the city, but guessed we would see petrol out in the country. We were wrong. Every petrol depot was empty or closed. Then we noticed this guy and stopped to ask him where we could get petrol. He told us there was a complete petrol shortage on the Moscow road, but he would sell us some from his army truck. This cost us double the normal price of about 30 cents, so we only bought a little. We eventually found a petrol bowser further down the road, but we had to leave quickly when men started running around with AK-47s.
Petrol here costs double what it costs in a service station, 50 cents instead of 25 cents.
The road we travelled is one of the most war-trodden areas in the world. Napoleon's and Hitler's armies were the last to attempt this journey. If only they'd had a Vauxhall, they might have succeeded.
This is the main street of Smolensk.
Finding a restaurant is just as difficult as finding petrol. Canteens in the hotel were common on our trip, and this is the one in Smolensk, just before Moscow. It's 9 p.m., but not many locals eat out, and there are very few visitors. This lack of a crowd was common in all the places we stayed, and we were usually the only guests in the hotel eating rooms.
Now, 8 o'clock in the morning. So we'll see how we go into Moscow.
The Russians have built many, many memorials to their millions of brave peasants who died protecting Mother Russia along this road.
To the brave Russian soldiers.
This is a roadside market, usually set up immediately past the police roadblocks. We were stopped over 100 times at these blockhouses, which are on every road into and out of every town. The police are always heavily armed and wear flak jackets. They merely move their batons a few centimetres and you must stop. We once drove on after the baton was raised. A few kilometres down the road, a car screeched to a halt behind us. Out jumped a furious cop with his gun at the ready. He ordered us to return to the blockhouse while he got back in his commandeered car. Before he managed to get back, the crowds had gathered around the open bonnet and his superior smiled and waved us on. We entered Moscow in grand style, with the flags flying on every lamppost and on the car. The roads were wide and cars driven very fast and in any which way. At traffic lights we saw begging gypsies with disabled people in wheelchairs dodging between the 8 lanes of fast traffic. Moscow is an unreal island in the middle of the most chaotic country I've visited. This is why Moscow resident permits are still very difficult to get. Against our better judgment, we arrived in Moscow on Yeltsin election day. All our Western contacts had fled back to the West in case the Second Russian Revolution started. Journalists were everywhere, hoping for blood and battles. We'd bought a powerful shortwave radio so we could hear the BBC News, which we hoped would help us plan our escape if rioting started. This is Red Square on the day of the election. All quiet. Nothing happened. Election day was declared a holiday, so everyone promptly left the city for their country dutches. These dutches are garden shacks, nothing like the presidential palace here. It was great to have a day on our feet enjoying the sights of Moscow. One of our Russian contacts, Professor Fyodorov, turned out to be a presidential candidate and was otherwise occupied. So we were left with the buskers. At dawn the morning after the elections, we drove past all the barriers, right into the middle of Red Square, and took pictures. The police eventually woke up and chased us out with stern warnings. But we got the pictures of the Vauxhall in front of St. Basil's Cathedral, the most famous Russian photo of all. A bored Polish TV crew filmed us as we were the only interesting thing they could find. In Moscow, we became aware of the very low technical standard of most things in Russia. Far from being a first world country, we found ourselves in a run-down third world country. As engineers, we noticed the skills of their tradesmen were sadly lacking. We couldn't even find a car museum, or even one old car in the whole of Moscow. After spoiling ourselves in Moscow, in a grand hotel, which was built by the Yugoslavs, we headed off into the unknown. As usual, we got lost on the way out of the city, and as expected, the roads deteriorated. This car in front was showing us the way out of Moscow, and already the road was atrocious. He did show us a way, but it was the wrong way, and we ended up doing a major detour. The Russians are very sure of their information, yet it is invariably wrong. We were given information about a detour around 600 kilometers of black cotton mud, reputed to be on the main highway. 2 Russians we met claimed they had driven this detour 2 days earlier, and that it was tarred all the way. We drove for about 50 kilometers at 10 miles an hour, cursing them all the way. We even began to wonder whether there was a quagmire on the main highway, or whether it too was folklore. With the bad roads and the dust, we were worried about the quantity of oil we would use. When we left Berlin, we were carrying enough oil for only 3 more changes, so whenever we could, we took the oil out and settled it overnight. We carried out the routine maintenance checks as often as possible. We preferred to do this in remote locations, like when we were camping, because we could spread out all our tools without them being stolen. This is the routine we went through every time we started the car. Still going strong. The bad roads led some bright apparatchik in the government to put up these ramps at regular intervals. They're environmental disasters because the Russians drop their broken parts and drain engine oil straight onto the ground. However, the Russians love their cars, and they do some amazingly complex repairs on the roadside. Looking up at the mark. Here was an owner fixing his back axle, assisted by his daughter. The bad roads cause many problems, especially for their tyres. They have bad quality rubber compounds and a poor quality manufacture. We would often see drivers changing tyres by the side of the roads. They'd be watched by their passengers, whose number far exceeded the normal capacity of the car. Novosibirsk, the halfway point. In the cities, there is no shortage of cars, though many of them break down because they are used infrequently due to the frozen winters and chronic tyre shortage. All cars are pretty much the same, so you'd often follow a group of these identical cars up a winding hill, all looking like some second-rate precision driving team. The cars come in a few faded colours, but the trucks come only in sky blue or army green. The sky blue ones run on petrol, and often travelled in a convoy with us. This was very comforting, especially when we never knew when we would find petrol again. We were always on the lookout for the fabled 1916 B-Type Vauxhall, but the oldest car we saw was this one, which looked only 30 years old. Typically, there was no detour around the roadwork, so everyone just drove on the semi-finished road, getting in the way of the construction crews. You had to be in the know if you wanted something in Russia. If you blinked, you could miss something important, like this automat in the middle of Siberian nowhere. It had an unusual assortment of goodies. They seemed to sell whatever they could, wherever they could. Once we needed to buy methylated spirits for our camping stove, and we tried every likely-looking store, asking anyone who would listen. They were very friendly, but their information was faulty, and after a few days we gave up and bought some vodka, hoping it would burn well enough. In Kazan, we stayed with our good friends Boris and Ludmila. They were very generous and kind to us, and it was a sad day when we had to leave them. They showed us inside Russian life and demonstrated how important friendship was to all Russians.
We were lucky to find them here. As you know, the police brought us all away.
These youths are stripping this car behind the Lenin Museum. This was the kind of theft we were most afraid of, especially since everyone ignored the crime. This museum was the last communist construction in Kazan. Here is a typical car compound where all the locals parked at night. Normally the compound had a withered old man who could barely stay awake during the day, let alone through the whole night. Usually he was assisted by a toothless dog, which was tied up so as not to hamper any potential thieves. One of the biggest problems we had was trying to find a safe place for the car at night, which took about 3 hours in the cities. We weren't too worried about the theft of the whole car because the thieves would have undoubtedly been stopped at one of the many police roadblocks. We were usually out of the cities by 7 a.m. before the museums or churches opened. We drove 9 to 12 hours a day, necessitating an early start. We camped as often as possible to reduce the number of hours wasted looking for hotels and parking. It was much easier to find a campsite down a side road than a city car park. However, camping was not without its own dangers. We used a couple of battery-powered infrared alarms placed on the bonnet and the trunk to warn of intruders. In deep forests, we hoped they would warn us of bears. We slept with a big spanner and a spotlight, and later, after we met some Americans, a can of mace. Fortunately, we never had to use any of these weapons. The food we cooked ourselves was much tastier and never the surprise it was in restaurants. We had packed limited supplies of freeze-dry food and other camping goodies for emergencies only. However, we soon used these up because camping was such a pleasure. We had grand plans of never ordering the same meal like airline pilots so that we both wouldn't get sick at the same time. This was a great theory, but it was hard enough to pick out one meal from the Cyrillic menus, let alone two. We were constantly worried about getting sick, as we were on a tight schedule, so we were very careful about our hygiene. We stopped to fill our water tanks at this single tap in a village and were surprised to find some kids who knew about kangaroos and the Australian flag. The 20-litre tube attached to our running board held the water for washing and drinking. We often washed on the side of the road and took it in turns to filter our water. We used this little handheld pump to sterilize all our drinking water, even the brown water from the hotel taps.
Well, we spent all our time videoing this damn storm, and we didn't put the roof up. So here we are, standing naked by the side of the road, drying ourselves off. Well, nothing. What are you complaining about? There's no water in there.
Well, here we are. We've recovered from the rainstorm.
Here we are amongst the tractors and the workmen.
We didn't stay for our prepaid breakfast at the hotels because the food was so unappetizing. So we stopped on the side of the road and cooked porridge on the running board. We didn't consume dairy products as part of our hygiene routine, so we had porridge without milk and bread without butter. The other problem with porridge was a lack of salt.
Well, this is us getting water. This lovely town.
These are the Westcots, the only Westerners we saw east of Moscow. They started in the northeast of Russia in January, where the only roads are frozen rivers. They had some incredible tales to tell about -66-degree camping, where the Russians keep their trucks running 24 hours a day for 4 months of the year. They too had a computer and a modem, and we coordinated a meeting over the internet. It was one of those great moments when adventurers meet in remote places. Being in a modern car, the Westcots had bad experiences with the police. The police were usually annoyingly inquisitive, but in the cities we found they were more useful than the bad local maps. We would seek out a policeman who would often show us the way to a hotel or a safe car spot. Sometimes they abused their power. We didn't mind.
That's a value plebs. Stop! Oh, look at that. It's easy when you know how.
We thought we'd struck pay dirt when we saw this scrapyard, but it turned out to be a lot of confiscated motorcycles piled up behind the police station. The police seemed to have very haphazard rules and a very haphazard way of enforcing them. We once saw them carrying out a mission control test, but we felt cocky because it was the only roadworthy test that we could pass. We weren't surprised to see so many confiscated bikes, as the Russians did crazy things on them. We grew tired of continually crossing the Trans-Siberian railway line, which ran parallel to the road for most of our journey. It was here that we discovered why there were so few warning signs. The Russians completely ignored them.
Well, the locals seem to go.
The reason for such bad roads is the government has invested so much in their railways. This was a locomotive graveyard with an incredible array of engines. These guys seem to have lifetime employment, sorting and resorting all the engines and their parts. They gave us some detonators and mistook our apprehension at taking these explosives as ignorance, so they proceeded to demonstrate them to us. When the first lot didn't work, they got some more, and then some more, until we had an entire battle on our hands. We also came across what we thought was an aeroplane graveyard, but in fact these planes are still in use.
But we don't know anything about airplanes.
Here we are in deep eastern Siberia. We are just entering the taiga, which is the largest continuous forest in the world. We had driven on bad roads for a few days and passed through some of the most simple villages ever seen. We felt really isolated and totally dependent on our very simple car. Here you get an idea of the vast flat land. You also get an idea of how difficult the navigation was using the Cyrillic alphabet. The second line says Irkutsk, and the bottom one says Chita. We also came across this sign showing a 1907 car. We wondered if it had something to do with the first Paris to Peking rally, which was run along this route in 1907. We finally made it to Irkutsk and became local celebrities. The hotel, which had previously tried to rip us off, organised a great press conference, and we ended up on TV. A number of times during our journey we were approached by Russian journalists. Generally they raced around town to find a translator for an interview, but if they couldn't, they just filmed us. Irkutsk is near Lake Baikal, which contains 1/5 of the world's fresh water, more than the American Great Lakes. It is also the deepest and perhaps the clearest lake, and is surrounded by the taiga forest and some of the most beautiful countryside we saw. Petrol was bought from depots, which had no toilets, oil, water or mechanics. They trusted no one, therefore we had to pay before filling our tank. The car has no fuel gauge, so we used the flagpole to measure the petrol level. We had to write down the quantity we needed because the money was collected by a woman in a concrete bunker who spoke no English. It was very stressful because she didn't know how to deal with foreigners, and the locals kept jumping in front of us. After she counted the money, she switched on the pump. If the nozzle was not yet in your tank, petrol sprayed everywhere. What you couldn't fit in your tank was lost without any refund. Then we repressurized our tank and we were on our way again.
This is Chita Hotel. This might just show you what the normal bathroom looks like before we do it here. A nice porous material. It looks like chipboard. Stuff's well soaked in it. And there's the broom to sweep up. They've obviously just been doing some plumbing here.
We spent a whole day in Chita arranging to get onto the train bound for Khabarovsk. The original road goes through Chinese Mongolia, and the Chinese do not allow vehicle entry into this military zone. The Russians put all their road vehicles onto the Trans-Siberian Railway for this 2,500 kilometre journey. Unfortunately, there were no passenger compartments, so we had to camp in the cattle wagon alongside our car. At least we could protect the car from the frequent bandit raids on the goods trains. The railways were so badly organised that nobody could tell us whether the journey would take 3 days or 6 days, and we even had to build our own makeshift ramp to get the car into the carriage. Once again our camping gear came in very handy. We'd replaced our methylated spirits with vodka and now discovered that it didn't burn very well. We were worried that we would run out of fuel or food, or worse, water. because we didn't know how long our journey would take. We sometimes stopped for 5 minutes, but other times for 5 hours. This uncertainty soon drove us to drink the vodka as well as burn it. Occasionally we could see a tap with cool water across the tracks not 25 metres away, but we couldn't risk being cut off by another train, so we stayed in the wagon at all stops and suffered in silence. We were very bored on the train, so we had to make our own entertainment. We had run out of books and had no music to listen to, so we carried out maintenance on the car. We'd had a few problems with the number 8 valve, so we took the opportunity to examine it and some of the other valves as well. Ablutions were another problem on the train. For the more serious stops we tried 3 different methods, but none were very elegant. For washing, however, we found an ingenious source of hot water, the radiator. We opened all the doors of the carriage and ran the car engine until the water was nice and hot. Then we swept off all the dust on the floor and filled a plastic bag with water. Much to the amusement of some workers at the side of the track, we washed naked. We even found some time to shave, using the freshly polished brass as a mirror. There was plenty of time to update our diary on the computer, but the batteries went flat before we could play any computer games. Our train nightmare ended in Khabarovsk after 5 days. We now had only 1 day to catch the ferry to Japan, and we were 900 kilometers from the Vladivostok docks. We raced off, leaving these Khabarovsk holidaymakers in their river. The roads were terrible. We ran out of petrol, our headlights smashed under the car. We drove 18 hours on that last day, but we made it. And here we are in the late evening at the entrance to Vladivostok, jumping for joy.
Give us a Toyota jump!
We had now reached the far eastern seaboard, completing our journey in only 5 weeks, half the time of the 1908 race. The next day we were helped by the Australian consulate in Vladivostok. We had missed the deadline for loading cars onto the ferry, so we needed official help. At 1 p.m, with the ship due to sail at 3, we were lifted on board. We had no insurance cover for the car, as we were unable to find anyone in Russia or abroad who would take the risk. So we were greatly concerned when the dock workers came out with frayed old rope and lifted the car in the most unsafe way. However, we were very, very glad to finally get the car safely off Russian soil without serious mishap. But the drama wasn't over yet. We did not have permission to import the car into Japan. The crew told us that we would not be allowed to drive our battered old car on the Japanese roads and we would have to return to Russia. But the captain warned us that the ferry was full for the return. He could not help us if the car was refused entry. The ship took 2 days to reach the west coast of Japan. We were met by our old friend and business partner, Yoshida-san, who drove 5 hours in the early morning to meet us. Being an old hand in the Japanese import-export business, he quickly cut through the red tape. We then had a beautiful drive along the rugged west coast of Japan, through plunging valleys and lush mountains. We passed through 26 tunnels on a lovely smooth road alongside immaculately kept fields. What an incredible contrast with Russia. On our first night in a luxurious ski resort, we stunned the chefs when we soldered a leaking petrol pipe over their gas cooking stove. After staying in Yoshida's house, we drove the last kilometers into Tokyo. Finally, we pulled into the Grand Palace Hotel in Tokyo, where Noel has stayed many times. He had told them about the impending trip when he went through Japan on his way to London, so they were very excited to see us return. We were very excited to be somewhere that felt like home. And that says it all for me. To feel that Japan is home shows how different Russia was for us. We have returned home. Now it seems as if it never happened. We have no scars, broken limbs or sickness to make us feel like we had a hard journey. Some people return from their dream adventure in a sorry, shattered state. How fortunate we were. Our adventure is over. We faced the challenges, and with some measure of good luck, a great deal of preparation and the help of many, we succeeded. Our immense dream came true. Alone, we drove an 83-year-old car, surely the oldest car to cross Russia, completing the entire route of the 1908 New York to Paris race. A very happy ending.